Televisión de calidad con sentido público. Universidad de Antioquia, Televisión.
Through the headphones. I've been invited to speak about schools and schooling for the future, and I'm from the OECD. I guess that was said in the introduction. We've been around, the OECD as an organization has been around for 50 years, and education has been a part of that throughout the 50 years. I would say it's probably more prominent now within the OECD, the work on education, partly because, of course, education is more important in general, but also because of developments like the PISA study. Now, I'm not from that particular section of the OECD. I don't work on PISA, but I work in the Center for Educational Research and Innovation, and it's been my good fortune explicit mechanisms, explicit methods for thinking about the future are really very helpful in the educational world. And I want to say something about the scenarios that we designed as part of our project on Schooling for Tomorrow. I want to talk about learning research and how that research can inform the redesign of learning. I want to address the whole question of learning environments, how we organize learning, which I think gives us a lot of insights as to how schools and schooling might be for the future. And then I want to come back to the scenarios and give some sense of how I see the future possibly, ideally, panning out on the basis of the foregoing. So, the future and why futures thinking. I think the first reason why it's important to have methods and methodologies for addressing explicitly the future is the paradox in education that it's an area which is fundamentally long-term, fundamentally an area of our society and our economy that works out over the very long term, and yet a great deal of thinking within education and the decision-making tends to be very short-term. There's a great deal of firefighting, there's a great deal of knee-jerk decision-making in education, despite the fact that it's such a long-term venture. Education is becoming increasingly complex, and that argues for new approaches. And if we're interested in education for change, if you might say reinvention and not just incremental reform, then we need to have some sense of what that change might be for and in what direction. Scenarios, it seems to me, offer a way of thinking about the future. They're certainly not predictions. We didn't say when we did our project on Schooling for Tomorrow that we had the answer about what the future would be, but we designed a certain number of possible futures, pure forms, that help to clarify what alternatives are, what different people's values are. They can be very useful in getting people to talk together about those things, and they can inform decision-making. It's not the scenarios themselves that do that, it's how they're used in decision-making processes and in a negotiation among different actors. And we found that our scenarios from the OECD were used in many different countries, in many different settings, precisely to do that. Now, the first scenario that we imagined, that we formulated, was really not a utopia at all. It was really a kind of back to the future scenario, which was saying that actually the future would be rather recognizable in terms of today, that things wouldn't basically change very much. In fact, we rather exaggerated this scenario to say that it would be back to the future. They would become even more entrenched, even more bureaucratic. So this was, we called this the bureaucratic school systems continue scenario. And we found that many people in the seminars and conferences that we had said that although they didn't like this one very much, they thought this was the most likely future in their school systems. So the question of what we want and the question of what we think will happen becomes very important. The second set of scenarios that we identified two were really seeing a much stronger school, remodeled school. So in other words, a strengthened, we call it the reschooling scenarios, and we identified two in this particular category. One we imagined, which is the discourse of a great deal of the reform discussion going on, of schools as really very focused learning organizations, nevertheless with quite a recognizable educational agenda, but revamped dynamic learning organizations. The second one we saw as the school being much more part of a wider set of community organizations and institutions, the school very much the hub, and we call that the school as core social center. And this appeal, this is more outward looking, if you like, but in both cases, the school is a very strengthened institution and prominent in our societies. We identified three, and if you like, what was an opposing set of scenarios to the second. That is, these were the deschooling scenarios. In the first one, we imagined a really very radical extension of markets, of learning markets. We imagined that the school would continue, but the whole range of other providers would come into the learning market, so to speak. So there would be a dynamic market, and this is something that many of us in education find very difficult to imagine. On the other hand, quite a lot of people in the different scenarios and conferences we had found the next one, learning networks and the network society scenario, a much more congenial one, even though actually we imagined that scenario as where the schools as formal institutions would actually disappear. So strangely enough, a lot of people in education like the idea of networks, like the idea of deschooling societies, despite the fact that would mean they'd lose their own jobs, teachers, education bureaucrats, and so on. I've always found that a rather paradoxical contrast, but nevertheless, that's certainly one of those futures that features quite strongly in the literature, and particularly among futurologists who've been imagining the disappearance of school as an institution for as long as I can remember. And the final scenario isn't really a complete scenario, but it was very potent when we designed it, because certainly in some of the OECD countries, and of course in some other countries still, there was a very severe crisis of teacher supply, a shortage of teachers for one reason or another, either because teaching was not a sufficiently attractive option and people were going elsewhere, or because of, in Southern Africa, when we were talking about this, because of serious health problems, HIV, AIDS, and so on, and the actual disappearance of teachers, literally. Nevertheless, that's a kind of catastrophe scenario, but where change comes about through essentially a real crisis of teacher supply. So those are the 6 scenarios that we designed and developed, and as I say, they were used in many different contexts, and I'll come back to those at the end. What I want to talk about next is really about how we moved from a focus on schooling, the institutions of schooling, thinking about the future in terms of what systems might look like, to learning. And to start with, perhaps just to say why such an interest in schooling, in learning. The first reason borders on the banal, but is nevertheless true. That is, increasingly we talk about our societies, our economies as being very much based on knowledge. This whole event is very much oriented around the whole idea that innovation, knowledge are really central parts of our society, of our economy, of our dynamism. And if that's the case, then automatically learning is at the heart as well. It sounds banal, but it's actually, I think, nevertheless, a really important point of departure. Certainly less banal is the very strong focus, and I've mentioned PISA already, on our sophistication in measuring outcomes, learning outcomes in different ways, and comparing them. That has become a very prominent part of the educational discourse internationally. But once you've understood that, once you have rankings of different countries, of different societies, and you've got different patterns that you've mapped through surveys like PISA, the question then is, what do you do about it? How do you make changes happen? And that automatically gets you into the whole question of how learning environments work and how they can be changed. The third reason, I think, is really quite a profound one, and that is that in education, in many of our countries, there's been reform going on for a very long time. In fact, there seems to be a kind of reform disease, and people talk about initiative fatigue because they seem to be battered by change after change after change. And yet there seems to be a sense that we've been changing all the time, but has anything really changed? And that argues, in my mind, for delving right back into the whole question of learning, the technical core, as some call it, the teaching-learning interface, rather than remain at the level of the structures and the levers that are normally available to policy. The final two factors I've put up together because they really argue for a potential for identifying how change might really come about. One, of course, is technology, the fact that we really do have a major advance in the possibilities of education and learning. So far, in a lot of countries, there seems to be some disappointment that despite the investments, despite the connections, this hasn't really reshaped learning environments in the majority of our schools. And the final factor there is the research base itself, which I'll be referring to in a second. That is, the research base on learning grows. It grows enormously all the time. And yet, even among learning scientists, there's, I think, a recognition that there is just not enough connection between the kind of research that's going on, the kind of results that are coming through, and their applications, their relevance, their accessibility to those in schools, to those in decision-making who would want to use the results of the research in order to shape their decision-making. So what you might call, it has been called by David Berliner, the great disconnect between learning research and the practical world. Now we have sought to address this through the first main publication from our work on innovative learning environments, and that's a picture of the cover right there. It's called The Nature of Learning, Using Research to Inspire Practice. And this section of my presentation, I want to give you some sense of the main conclusions that emerged from that. First of all, the table of contents, that's not in a way terribly interesting, but just for you to see that what we managed to do, some of you will recognize some of the contributors there, rather well-known figures in the learning and educational world, people like Linda Darling-Hammond, Lauren Resnick, Rich Mayer, Bob Slavin, and Dylan William. We talked them, we persuaded them, we sweet-talked them into, for very little money, writing pieces for us. And we designed it so we asked them to really think through what very large areas of research boil down to in terms of their real significance for redesigning learning environments. You see, we started with some rather theoretical chapters on the nature of learning, and we moved through to some of the important areas of more practical application in areas like group learning, technology, formative assessment, problem-based learning, and so on. So that was a report that we put together, and I want to give you a flavor of the conclusions that emerged from that. We were very keen that they shouldn't stay as a set of discrete chapters, because then the whole problem of the disconnect, that you have very interesting separate reflections, but you do not bring them together in forms and formats relevant for teachers, for educators. We were very mindful of that, and so we sought to provide a set of transversal conclusions, and here they are. The first one really is that learning environments really have to have learning at the center, and that they must make engagement absolutely critical to their activities. As opposed to the notion of learning as somehow a rather private and rather individual activity, to ensure that learning is social and often collaborative. And the benefits of collaborative learning are very clear, and the chapter by Bob Slavin summarizes that evidence rather well. They should be very highly attuned to learner motivations and emotions. Easy to say, not so easy to do, but the fact that whether people are positive and encouraged, or whether they're anxious, whether they feel stupid, are all factors that have an enormous impact on the capacity to learn and the success of the learning that goes on. This is one of the toughest, the extent, this one and the next one, which are very much about the importance of learning environments being acutely sensitive to individual differences, and that prior knowledge, what learners bring to the learning, is an absolutely essential predictor and one of the strongest of the success that they will have in learning in a particular situation. The learning needs to be demanding, but without excessive overload. In other words, it has to be bumping up against each individual's limits of proximal development. In other words, no coasting on the one hand, but not excessive grind and overload on the other. That's also, those two go hand in hand. Assessments are absolutely central to education, much as sometimes we might not like them, but assessments are part of the lifeblood of any learning situation. But for them to be really effective, they have to be consistent with the aims of the learning, with a very strong focus on formative feedback, giving feedback, using those assessments to inform everybody involved, especially the learners, how they're learning, what they're learning, how they might learn better. And there should be a connectedness across different activities, as opposed to the compartmentalization, the fragmentation of so much education into different classes, different subjects, unconnected. There needs to be horizontal connectedness across activities, across subjects, and across the learning that goes on within schools and outside of schools. Now, some people have said, well, that's all, we kind of know that. That sounds very familiar. But to my mind, that's not a very satisfactory response to those set of principles, partly because, of course, they are familiar in that they've been culled from, they've been drawn down from 100 years of learning research, so in a sense there's nothing new about them, but they add up to a radical agenda as far as we can see, partly because they do not at all typify the schools and classrooms in many of our countries. So really the gap between what research is telling us is really makes for an effective learning environment, and what goes on in many schools is there's a large divide. So that's already an argument in favor of innovating for the future. But also we would say that it's not a question of choosing one or two of those. saying yes, we want formative assessment, or yes, we need collaborative learning, that these are all essential ingredients of a really effective learning environment. And therefore, that adds up to, I think, quite a radical agenda. I just want to say a word about technology, because I know that's a very strong theme throughout this whole conference and convention. And I've already mentioned that there is some sense of disappointment abroad, I think, that investments have not really made more impact. But if we go back to that, or if we look at that list there of principles, you can see how strongly they fit with the potential of digital media and information technologies. The whole point about engagement, young people find using technology, digital media, engaging. That's the very first point right there. The whole emphasis given to collaboration, project work, and research. That is where technology really does come into its own and offers all kinds of possibilities. The importance of personalization, of individualizing learning, monitoring, following how well different individuals are doing rather than hoping that they're learning. Clearly, technology offers all kinds of possibilities there. So it's a framework that I think is very much related to the potential of technology. I could say more about that, but I think with the passage of time, I will move on. Just to restate those principles in more educational terms, I think they add up to an agenda that's essentially learner-centered. I'll jump over the second one because I'll come back to that. I think we are talking about really profoundly personalized learning environments which are sensitive to individual differences. It is about inclusivity. It's not about letting some learners float and miss out and be unengaged. It really is about engagement of everybody. It's about social learning. The second point I'll come back to, the whole question of the design. It seems to me that that set of principles adds up to really an argument for there being very careful design in learning environments. Clearly there is an important role for individual autonomy, self-study, inquiry, and so on. But to realize that set of principles really is a very demanding professional agenda. And so in the first one, talking about learner-centeredness, we don't see that as in any way as an alternative to the key role of teachers. In fact, unless teachers and other learning professionals are really highly professional, are understanding these different ways of shaping, and I'll come onto that in a moment, the different shaping of different learning environments, then they will not be realized. So it is actually a demanding professional agenda which, to my mind, puts teachers right in the front line as the orchestrators of learning. I wanted to talk now a little bit about, I'm going to have to rush through this section because I've only got 60 minutes, 70 minutes left, so I will not spend as long on this section as I might have done. Let me just say that this seems to me to be the framework. It seems terribly simple, but the framework that informs a lot of thinking about education. You've got a system, you've got schools in the system, you've got classes, the class, the classroom, the teacher, and the learner. It seems to me that that, in one form or another, however crude that might seem, is actually the framework that informs a great deal of our thinking and a great deal of research for that matter. And there seems to me a number of reasons why when learning is to the fore, that is really not a very adequate framework. First of all, it seems to me it isn't adequate because it's really expressed in terms of institutions rather than configurations of learning. So it's about institutions, the school, the classroom, the system, rather than the organization of learning. Secondly, and related to that, it's assuming really, and we're talking here about the future of schooling, what education might be like in the future, it assumes essentially that existing institutions offer you the framework for trying to think through what the future might be. In other words, it's rather discouraging of thinking about innovation. It's rather discouraging of thinking about a variety of arrangements where the school is, for example, working in some kind of partnership where the learning goes on partly in the formal setting of the school, partly in non-formal settings. It conflates the organization of learning with the institution rather than problematizing those relationships and throwing them into sharper relief. And that's something that we are very keen to in some way unpick and problematize in our work on innovative learning environments. And as important as any of those reasons why that's an unsatisfactory framework, it's very individualistic, and it makes for very fragmented thinking. It talks about the school, the class, the teacher, and actually in terms of the learning that goes on, including the learning of the different individuals in any learning setting, that's not actually how learning works. Learning is a much more holistic endeavor involving a whole set of experiences, not this very fragmented staccato imagery of the school, the class, and so on. So we have felt it important to rethink the micro level, as we would call it. And the framework I'm going to put up here applies to whether we're talking about innovative or traditional learning environments. We think that that's a learning environment, that we can think of it in terms of who the learners are, who I've put teachers in inverted commas, those who are engaged in the learning professionals, so to speak. Who are they? What are their skills? What are their attitudes? What are their qualifications? What's their profile? Learning what? The competencies, knowledge, and values that are embedded in that learning environment. Content. The resources. Of course, when we talk about learning environments, a lot of people automatically think just of this, of the resources, the setting, the technology, and so on. We see that as a part, but not the whole by any means of the whole learning environment. And we think of that in terms of where and with what, which is about facilities, it's about use of space, it's about use of technology, whether advanced or simple technology. And it's about organization, the how. And we see that as absolutely at the center, the how, the organization of learning. And in fact, as the piece that really links those other four, the engine room, so to speak. And in terms of how is the relationships organized between learners, teachers, content, the resources, and how can we think of that through in terms of different structured learning activities, pedagogy, and the use of information and feedback over time. So that's very much our understanding of what a learning environment is, and this gives us the possibility of also a framework for thinking through about innovation in terms of where's the sources of innovation in a particular learning environment. Are we looking at innovations in terms of the profile of the learner? And this is, I'll miss out a whole set of slides which are coming next, which look at each of these in some detail. But are we looking in terms of the profile, innovations in terms of, say, the age mix within different learning environments? Are young people learning side by side with adults, with parents, with their grandparents? Who the teacher is, the way in which teachers are organized? Are other adults being brought in to the learning environment in different ways with different expertise and competencies, combining with a core of professional teachers? Are there innovations in terms of the values, in terms of what a lot of people are talking about in terms of 21st century skills and competencies? What kind of innovative curriculum essentially are being offered? Innovations in terms of use of space and technology, and clearly that's something of great deal of interest to many of us. How can we use what we have in a more innovative, flexible way, which actually realizes the principles that I put up earlier on, rather than rigid boxes where everyone's shut inside because that's the way we've always done it. And particularly innovations in terms of how all that is put together. innovations in terms of scheduling, timing, grouping of learners, pedagogies, different forms of assessment, and so on. So that's the framework that we're using, and we are in the middle of compiling a whole set of, we've got about 120 so far, and of those, about 30 in-depth case studies that we're seeking to understand in more detail what some of the options and possibilities are to innovate in different learning environments. And these are the countries, provinces, and organizations that have actively engaged with our project. So we've managed to attract a really quite an impressive set of countries, states, provinces, and so on, because everyone is struggling. Everyone is struggling with the issue, how can we redesign learning in a way that really is appropriate for the 21st century. Well, I think I'll skip these were, if you like, illustrations of the different innovations, those focused on teachers, those focused on content. We have examples from our different participating countries for each of those innovations in terms of organization. So I'm just running through those quickly. Here I'd like to put this together, put the learning environment into a broader framework and how we see that. You remember the hierarchical system school teacher diagram that I put up at the beginning. This is really our model, which is, and it's not finished because I realize that it's still excessively hierarchical, but nevertheless, with the environments at the center, the learning environment, but also the institutional environment. By that I mean the organizations like schools or the different hybrid institutional environments in which learning for young people takes place. It may be in communities, it may be in schools, but to problematize that and to try and think of ways in which, because we're aware that there's a lot of literature on grammars of schooling, meaning how organizations make it very difficult to innovate, very difficult to change. Question, how can we make more consistent, more synergized the relationship between the learning environment, the organization of learning, and everything else that's going on in a place called school? So that we see as at the core. We think the meso level, which is essentially the connections between one learning and institutional environment, that might be a school, and others, is absolutely critical. It's only through a strong meso level networking, clustering, that you can go to scale. So it seems to us that that is missing from this very hierarchical and very individualistic understanding of how systems work. We think the meso level and the micro level, for us the micro level, are absolutely essential. And the role of policy to support learning is very much how can we, through policy, support the environments at the micro and the meso level. How can we foster learning leadership? How can we foster more coherent connections between organizations and the way in which learning is organized? And how can we foster networking and clustering? That's a very important role for policy, and that's we see as very much a strong role for the macro level. This you might call the atomic level of individual classes and learners, but I think that's rather misleading, because really essentially we see those as in that yellow rectangle, the learning environment. That's a diagram to be reworked. So in the 5 minutes that I've got left, first of all, to recap then on schooling in the future. It seems to me that it can be realized in all sorts of different ways. There isn't a school of the future, and a lot of schooling may take place outside of places we call schools. But a lot of it will be around the future, the positive future will be around creating more effective learning environments, following the kind of principles that I outlined before, coming from the research, with strong learning leadership, and very much organized around 21st century learning agendas. working towards consistency between the technical core, so to speak, the learning, the teaching and learning, and the institutional environments. That would be a key part of how any organization will work, trying to make sure that there's not inconsistency, that there's not conflict between the way in which we're trying to organize the learning on the one hand, and a whole set of other considerations that are inevitable in organizing a school, for example. That there should be schools in the future should be very much integrated into strong and dynamic networks and communities of practice across different environments. And that's about growing good practice rather than upscaling. There'll be a whole set of different models, and so I don't think the language of upscaling is a very relevant one. I think it's much more about growing in a more organic way, in ways determined often by those on the ground. And that policies will provide support and build capacity to realize those other three aspects. So coming back to the scenarios, this is the final part of my presentation. You'll recall that these were the ones that we identified. The 6, people have very different reactions to them. What might a future be? What might an Istant's future be that in some way takes different aspects, and what might they look like? We know that a lot of people in education are very keen, a lot of people in the sort of futures world are very keen to, if you like, deinstitutionalize education. But it seems to me that there is very much a place for some bureaucracy, that just letting things go, hoping that individuals, communities will somehow by themselves, without strong policy, without a strong public role, it seems to me that's a very unlikely future for learning systems. You do need policy. All the research and all I think our understanding of what makes for good citizens and good learning add up to me to there being very much some kind of shared learning and social experience of young people up to, say, the age of 13. And that one can call reschooling, if you like, but some kind of strong foundation, really laying the basis for learning throughout the rest of life. Without that, I think if you have very fragmented learning and hoping that that adds up across a society, I think that's unlikely to work. So I would be very much an advocate of reschooling up in terms of trying to lay the foundations as strongly as possible. But in terms of building on that foundation, I think it's quite compatible for learners beyond that, say 13, 14 years of age, to have a whole mix of experiences, of different arrangements that might be a mix of what you might call reschooling and deschooling. But that depends on there being a very strong foundation already laid. And finally, it strikes me that it is really important to think in terms of lifelong learning. We've rather, in many of our societies, lost that. I think there's a tendency to expand from the front end, which was the argument for lifelong learning when it was first formulated 40 or so years ago, was precisely how to have an alternative to simply growing systems more and more and more. The front-end model, as it's been called. People staying longer and longer in education, as opposed to there being a much more flexible and a much more varied set of educational careers. So it strikes me that one thing that is very useful is to think in terms of all of these together, but of course that depends on there being a very strong foundation. It does depend on there being a whole set of arrangements for young people in different settings, some formal, some non-formal, many of them blended, many of them suited to their particular needs and their particular backgrounds from that age onwards, and then building into a genuine lifelong learning system. My time is 30 seconds, so I will give you my last slide, which is to recap. This is what I think the schooling of the future should be. There should be explicit attention, that was my starting point, explicit attention to the kind of future that we want, using methods that really help us to think through and to incorporate futures into our decisions that we make and our innovations. We need to put learning first, and that closely informed by research about how we learn best. I think it's very important to reformulate our understandings of how learning organizations work, so to reformulate away from this system, school, class, bureaucracy that we tend to use, and much more towards learning environments and networks with policies supporting those. We're not talking about a school of the future, but all kinds of different models, and with awareness that resource limitations are a reality that can't be ignored. It's no good just having prototypes that cost a fortune. That is not a reality for many of our societies. We need to have a strong schooling foundation, in my view, with a whole variety of blended options built on top of that, and that should be aiming towards really thinking through in terms of 21st century competencies, deep learning, sustainability, and lifelong learning. Thank you very much.
Televisión de calidad con sentido público. Universidad de Antioquia, Televisión.